Now.
It's made it.
But, yeah.
Right, okay. Right.
Should we
So we just start. Right. So hello everyone. My name's Bob Steer. Some of you know me as the Planning and Performance General Manager, and you're blessed with me today. And Debs, can you hear me, Debs? Right. To give a very brief lecture, if you like, on activated sludge settlement in order to improve some of our performance. So, what are my objectives? My objectives are to clarify why the golden measures that we've got for activated sludge plants are so key to our performance, to demonstrate the links between the measures, and to dispel a few urban myths around activated sludge settlement. So the audience for this is a mix of audience really. If you're a operator of activated sludge plants, if you're a process technician or manager, if you're people that need to ask questions around activated sludge issues, or if you're just a bit of a nerd like me and you're just interested. So that would be the audience. Okay, right. So the roadmap. So the roadmap of what we're going to do today then. So we're just going to start off by thinking a bit about why this is important. Then we're going to go on to about why am I here? Why am I talking about it? What do I know? I'm going to share with you two simple pictures that are going to be the key for the rest of the session. I'm going to go back to the old school by talking about the WRC nomograph, which is a fairly old-fashioned way of doing some activated sludge settlement stuff, but it works really well. I'm going to do some worked examples, things that make you go so things that I come across that make me think I'm not quite sure whether folk really get this, and then end it. Okay? So, I need to find a place to put these. So, first of all then, why is this important? Well, so you'll all be aware that there's the non-improvement group that's been running, which is why you're all here today, wherever you are, in one of the sessions. You'll be aware that the failure modes we usually have for KPI 13 have been historically around aluminium, they've been around iron, BOD upper tiers and metals. If you were to summarise it, we don't get many failures into that KPI for ammonia, for example. So if you do a bit more digging, what that's led us to believe after a while is actually, usually those failures are associated with solids loss of some description from activated sludge. Okay, so if you bear with me on that hypothesis, then if you Pareto the solids loss, well, often that is associated with blanket loss from an activated sludge plant, and we'll come on to clarify exactly what that means. So we've done a load of stuff. We've got the golden measures, which go a long way to mitigating that, and I think generally they're in and running, but we're still getting the odd blanket carryover issue. So I think it's important that people understand the context of those measures in sort of running their plants. Okay, so, bit of trumpet blowing here then, so why am I talking to you about it? As it happens, I don't know many things about many things, but as it happens, I've got a PhD in activated sludge settlement. I started in this company as a process technician, then a process advisor. I worked in Dave Briffett's job, what he's doing now as a process engineer and development manager, and I've been various guises of operations managers or service delivery managers running these plants for real. And I've had every disaster going, so I know what I'm talking about in that respect. And I guess nowadays I sit on the performance side, so I watch some of the things that are happening, and I think I've got something to give. So that's why I'm talking about it. Okay, and all of that, I just had my 15-year award the other day, which was very nice. So we're going to pause it there, and then I'm going to pick it up in a minute with a couple of simple diagrams. Right then, so I said I was going to share two pictures with it. Are you enjoying it so far, Debs? Right. Okay, come on then, we'll be all right. So. This is the first picture. So this is my schematic of an activated sludge plant. So you may be familiar with this. Hopefully you will. So just to clarify, my purpose here isn't to teach every element of activated sludge, because I figure you probably know most of that already. And in truth, many of you know all of this, but I'm going to do a simplified version. So we've got the aeration tank. So it's being mixed with something, whether it's air or a mixer. It's got bubbles running through it. You're probably used to things like mixed liquor suspended solids, so how much biomass is there in that tank. And for the purpose of this today, we're going to be talking about measuring that in grams per litre. Now you're often used to milligrams per litre, but you'll see why I'm doing it that way in a minute. So grams per litre, so just for the avoidance of doubt, if we've got an example, so for example 3,000 milligrams per litre would just simply be 3 grams per litre. I think you can work that out. So we've also got the Standard Sludge Volume Index, which is a measure of how well does that sludge settle. And that's got weird units, millilitres per gram actually, the units, but we don't worry too much about that. So that's the contents of there. That's the final settlement tank on the right, a very simplified version, so you can see there's some stuff coming into it, there's some return activated sludge coming round, and then there is some stuff going to the river. What I'm going to start to talk about is this underflow rate. So Q in this context means discharge. So what I mean by discharge is, you might think of it as flow rate, but it's how many metres cubed per hour of stuff is coming out. So the reason we use the word discharge is because if you use the word flow, it means different things to different people. Some people think of it as a velocity, some people think it's a volumetric discharge. So we're going to use Q for that, and we're going to use Q, the discharge of the stuff going to the river. Similarly, there's amount of flow coming in, or discharge coming in metres cubed per hour. So let's put some numbers on this then to make this work. So if you imagine you've got a site that's got, say, 100 metres cubed per hour coming in. So that would be what? 100 times 24, that'd be a 2.5 megalitre per day dry river flow works. So typical whether that's coming in. So you've got 100 coming into this system, you've got a loop going around, so you've got 100 going out. And say for the argument's sake, say you also have a RAS loop going which has got 100 metres cubed per hour. So clearly if you've got 100 coming in and 100 coming out and 100 going around there, at this point here you've got 200 because you've got that 100 there and it joins up with this 100 here. So 200 there, 200 metres cubed per hour there, 100 goes to the river, 100 comes back round, and there you've got your loop. That's fairly important, and it's pretty key because what we're going to talk about in a minute is all about a bit of a mass balance around this stuff. So it's important to kind of get our minds around that there's 200 of these things coming in, 100 going around the bottom, 100 going out the top. Okay, so I think the only other thing to say is so I've called that Q0 and QU, which you can see is a 200, 100, which we're going to use in a minute when we look at this chart in a minute, we call Q total. So that's the total flow coming in and also the RAS that's going onto the final tank. And that's going to be really important in a minute because that dictates how much solids you've got hitting that tank every hour. Okay, we pause it there. Right then, so now we're just going to look at our final tank. So this is just the right hand side of that other picture we looked at. So this is the final settlement tank here. And it's a very simplified version of it. You'll recognise a few things from it. We've got the Q total coming in, the Q0 going to the river. So in our example that we just used, that was 200 metres cubed per hour coming in, 100 going out, 100 coming back round, called QU, which goes in the return activated sludge line. And remember, that's just returning biomass to the start of the reactor to do its work. Now, in truth, these are quite complex tanks, and there's a whole manner of people in Dave Griffith's team will be able to do fancy computer modelling of these. But for the purposes of what we want to do today, you can think of it in a very simple way. You can think of it as a game of two halves. The top half of the tank, imagine that the water is quietly coming up and going over the weirs, and you can approximate that to a uniform velocity going up. The bottom half of the tank is getting sucked down by the RAS pumps, and so it's coming downwards. Now, in truth, the fluid dynamics are a bit more complex than that. So, why am I going into this detail? Because I think to understand the context of what we're talking about next, I think you need to understand that in the end, what this is all about is velocities. Is a particle going to be settling fast enough to stay in that tank, or is it going too slow and it's going to get carried over? So, to help understand that a bit more, I'm just going to talk about the two things that a final tank's got to do. A final tank's got to do essentially two things. One, it's got to clarify the effluent, and by that I mean get rid of the tiny little bits. Secondly, it's got to thicken the return activated sludge so that you're not pumping great big quantities of the stuff around. So today we're not particularly interested in the clarification, but as a bit of an aside, if you just imagine yourself as a particle of a small flock in the top half of that final tank, if you've got an upflow velocity coming over that weir, if that particle settles fast, if you imagine having that in a jar on the side of the bench and you were looking at that particle and you imagine it settling down through the jar, if that speed going down is faster than the speed coming up of the fluid, then it'll stay in the tank. If it can't beat the flow coming back, then it'll go over in the effluent. So upflow velocity, as it's called, the speed of the water going up in the tank, is a really important parameter for understanding how well is that tank going to clarify. So that's why, for example, anything that increases the upflow velocity in a tank is likely to give you a poorer effluent quality. So for example, if you take a tank out of service and you've got to get all that flow through less tanks, you're going to have a faster flow up. So you're going to struggle. So happy days, I said, if that poor little blighter of a flock can get back down through that. Now in the bottom half of the tank, things are slightly different. The sludge acts as what's called in a hindered way. So it binds with its neighbours around it, and so it doesn't act as a single blob. It acts as what we call a blanket. And there's a couple of things to know about that blanket. Similarly, that blanket's got two things acting on it. This time they're going in the right way. The blanket itself, if you imagine putting it on the side in a jar, will settle in just like an SSVI test, will settle in the jar quite slowly. At the same time, we've got the underflow velocity sucking that out of the tank, pulling it down. So there are two things causing that sludge to go to the bottom of the tank, which is good news. So all things being equal, you would think that that sludge can get out of that tank okay. So I've called that V sludge and VU. So what affects VU? This is the underflow velocity. The only thing for a given tank that affects that is how fast you're pumping the RAS round. So if you pump the RAS really fast, you have a big VU. If you stop RAS pumping, VU will diminish to nothing. So there's only two things to know about this picture, and that is these. What goes in must come out. So if I've got a load of sludge coming in, generally speaking, all of that will go out the bottom in terms of solids, and nothing will come out in the effluent. If you think about it, in grams per litre terms, we might have 3 grams per litre coming in as mixed liquor suspended solids, because we know that's what's come from that tank. In our effluent, that was the flow by the way, in our effluent we wouldn't expect there to be anything like that, sort of 0.00 grams per litre, so nothing in the effluent normally. So if we've got 200 coming in at 3 grams per litre and 100 going out, which has got to contain all the solids, then pretty much, as sure as eggs is eggs, you're going to have that coming out at 6 grams per litre. So it's going to be twice as thick coming out as it is coming in, because that's just a simple mass balance of the thing. So what goes in must come out. First principle. And the second really important principle is, remember we said about that blanket, which were to settle in a jar? Well, blankets go much slower when the sludge is thick. So if you try and look at how a blanket settles, if you've got 6 grams per litre, it will settle quite quick. 12 grams per litre, it's really slow. 15 grams per litre, it's almost stopped. So those two things are really important. So the mass balance thing and also the sludge blanket. And why is that important? It's important because you can keep chucking sludge into this tank, that's fine. And normally, in this scenario, it'll just keep doubling the concentration of what comes out. A point will get reached where, if you put too much sludge in, it'll all slow down enough that it just can't get it out of the tank. It'll slow down too much and it can't get out of the tank. That's when you get a blanket carrier build up. That's when you get the and that's when it gets to a point where it gets up here, that it gets carried over in the effluent. So, what are the factors then? So let's talk about that in a bit more detail. So things that affect this then. So, in that picture we've described, SSVI, so the settlement in that column, that's a standard settlement test. If you've got a poor SSVI, you're going to have a poor velocity of the blanket of the sludge. Makes sense, doesn't it? If you sat there and you think this isn't settling very well, what you're saying is the sludge isn't settling very well for the liquid. So that's important. And remember, it's the only thing in your favour is settling through the liquid itself and then the whole liquid being pulled out. They're the things you want in your favour. If you've got high mixed liquor suspended solids coming into your tank, that means the mass balance thing says you must have a really high RAS solids. And we've already established if you've got a really high RAS solids, that means the blanket's going to slow right down. So that's why you've got a slow V sludge again. So it manifests itself in the same way. If you've got a low RAS flow, you've got a slow VU. So the two things acting for you, the velocity of the liquid and the velocity of the stuff through the liquid, you're now affecting this one if you stop the RAS. If you've got high flow coming into the plant, again it's back to the mass balance. You've got so many kilograms of sludge hitting that tank that you're going to have a high concentration of RAS solids, which means that you'll have a slow velocity of sludge. And the last one, if you take a tank out, so the final tank out, then you're affecting the area, which is effectively saying for each tank you're going to have to get more sludge to the bottom of each one, so again it will affect the velocity of the sludge. It'll have to be thicker and slower. Which is why all of these things are key factors in blanket carryover. And we'll come on to see how they interrelate now. Thank you. Right, good, so I'm nearly there. Right then, so you've had all the basics, now let's go for the theory. This is what we're going to be going through in a minute. Of course we're not. We're going to do something much easier than that. So, WRC, donkeys years ago, invented something called the nomograph, which brings all those bits of theory we just talked about together to say, so what? So when am I going to struggle with my final tanks and when is it going to be alright? And it looks a little bit old school, which is probably because it is a bit, because it was written I think in 1975, but it pretty much holds. There are much fancier ways of doing it, but this is pretty good. So, what this seeks to do is seeks to say, for a given works, you've got a given set of tanks, you've got a surface area to them, you've got a given flow coming in, you've got flow to full treatment, you've got mixed liquor suspended solids. Under what conditions will your final tanks struggle, or when won't they struggle? And what it is a game of two halves. On this half here, this is all about how much solids can your final tank take to the bottom and get out of the system. So this is about the capacity of your final tank to settle solids. And therefore you shouldn't be surprised to know that the sort of things that are on there are things about the SSVI, so the Sturge Sludge Volume Index, and also what is the underflow rate in terms of your RAS return. And all this does is it starts to do a bit of a dot to dot. So for a given SSVI and a given underflow rate, it says your tank is capable of getting rid of that much solids. Easy. Right, the other side of the equation is how much are you trying to put onto that final tank. And so again, you shouldn't be surprised at the sorts of things that crop up there. So, what's the mixed liquor suspended solids? And that's measured in here in grams per litre, so we talked about that earlier on. So, for example, 3 is 3 grams per litre of mixed liquor suspended solids, which means 3,000 milligrams per litre in our old money. So the more solids you are, the more you're going to ask to do with your tank. And then this is how much flow have you got going on to your final tank. So this is the total of how much, if you remember in our diagram before, what's the return rate plus what's coming in. And given that we're looking at worst case scenario here, we're always interested in storm conditions, so at flow to full treatment. So similarly, you'll get your work out for your site, what's your mixed liquor, what's your total flow divided by your surface area, and it'll say how much solids am I trying to put onto my tank. So what you're looking for to be comfortable is your solids loading going onto your tank is much less than the tank is capable of getting rid of. If that's a situation, happy days, you'll be alright. But if these lines start to get close to each other, then you can start to say, actually, there's quite a risk here that I'm asking more of my final tank than it can give. And you know, we talked about the principles early on about what goes in must come out. So if it can't go out through the bottom of the tank, it's going to come out through the top, and you're going to get a blanket carryover. Blanket carryover means high solids. High solids means high BOD, means high aluminium and iron, means failing KPI 13. That's why we're here, remember. So, okay, so what we're going to do is I'm going to go through some a fictitious real example. So anyone in process engineering, don't kill me too much if I've got the numbers slightly wrong, but I did them on a fag packet a minute ago. So I'm going to reveal over here what we're talking about. So Debs, can you see this all right? That's a bit of a little wobble. So, right, in our fictitious example, to use sort of numbers that we might be familiar with, we've got a dry weather flow of 10 megalitres per day. So it's a relatively smallish size, perhaps pocket activated sludge plant. So 10 megalitres per day is 10,000 metres cubed per day. Flow to full treatment, therefore, is likely to be something like 25,000 metres cubed per day. And the underflow rate, the RAS rate in its maximum conditions is likely to be something like 15,000 metres cubed per day. So that would be a typical setup. So therefore, this wants us to understand what's the total flow divided by the surface area of the tanks. So therefore, the total flow coming in is the total of the return activated sludge rate plus the flow coming in. So it's that plus that. So it's 40,000 metres cubed per day. is the total flow going on to the final tanks in storm conditions. So, if I imagine in my fictitious example I've got 3 20-metre diameter tanks, each one of those, allowing for a bit of wastage, each one of those has got a surface area of about 298 metres squared. So I've got 3 tanks with that much area. And the area is really important because remember we're talking about, the key thing in the end is what are the velocities involved. So the bigger the tank, the slower the velocities for a given flow. So, what does that tell us? Well, that tells us, oh, and the other thing is, in my fictitious example I've said that the mixed liquor suspended solids is 3,000 milligrams per litre, which you'll all know is the same as 3 grams per litre. That's fairly standard. And in my example, the SSVI is a good settling sludge, so an SSVI of about 80. So, you know, if you go to somewhere that's got iron dosing, they may be down at 60s. If you got somewhere like back in the day, we went up to Newark, is Martin Blackwell in the room? Newark, we might well have had an SSVI well up over 100, maybe 120. So, the key things I'm going to want to plot on my little ready reckoner, my little dot to dot, are, it wants to know what's the Q total divided by A, so that's easy. It's that flow divided by the surface area in total, so it gives me a number of 1.86 metres per hour. So I can stick that on my chart. So 1.86, I'm going to have one of my dots is going to go through there. And what is the QU over A? It's 0.7 metres per hour. So the other one of my dots is going to go on here. So now I like this bit, I've got these little magnetic things. I'm going to say, so what am I asking of my tank? I'm saying 3 grams per litre is my mixed liquor suspended solids. Put it through there. I've got that much flow. So I need my tank to be able to remove about 5.5 kilograms per metre squared per hour. So what is my tank capable of doing? Well, it's capable of, its SSVI is 80, we said, so that's one of my dots. So I'll do a dot there. I've said that the underflow velocity divided by area is 0.7, so it's capable of getting rid of about 8.5. Happy days, right? So at the moment, in this normal circumstances, my tank will be fine, because I'm saying that although there's a bit of plus or minus on this calculation, that's saying I'm putting less onto my tank than it's capable of taking out. So the reason I want to show this is not just to do a dot to dot, it's to show how sensitive life is to a few small changes. So I'm just going to play through 5 quick scenarios to show when you might struggle. So first of all, the first test I want to do is to say, well, if we're running our plant with 3,000 milligrams per litre or 3 grams per litre mixed liquors, if I've got a problem with my belt or my drum thickener, and suddenly it goes up to, say, 4,000 milligrams per litre and everything else stays the same, let's see what happens. So if I now put a dot at 4,000 and keep everything else the same, I have to go through that dot too. I think you can straight away see that, okay, it's still slightly above my line, so I'm still technically okay, but there's a plus or minus on this. That says to me, this site may well have a blanket issue under those conditions. So it's not much of a change, is it? 3,000 up to 4,000 can be all the difference between a blanket carryover or not, which is why it's so important on the golden measures to be really bob on your mixed liquor suspended solids. Of all the things in the world, that's a really sensitive measure. So, similarly you can see that if I can get away with running my plant down at 2,000, because I can still fully nitrify that, you can see that actually I create myself a lot of headroom, and I can mitigate the risk of other things going wrong. So I'm going to put it back to how it was to start with. That's my original state. So I'm back to 3,000 milligrams per litre mixed liquors. So other things then. What if I take in 20% more flow than I should be? So my inlet penstock doesn't work very well, and I take in 20% flow. So what happens then? So under those circumstances, the Q total goes up, and it goes up to about 2.1 there. So it makes a difference, but it doesn't make a massive difference, and actually, technically speaking, it's not an awful bit different. So it's sensitive to taking too much flow, but it's one of a factor of things. If you have that at the same time as having a high mixed liquor, at the same time as having an SSVI, it makes a difference. But in and of itself, it's not a massively strong lever. So other scenarios then. What if I've got blocked, so put it back to its original state. What if I've got a blocked final tank? If I've got a blocked final tank and my return, my underflow discharge gets halved, say, for a period. So fairly simply, I put that from there down to that. Straight away you can see that they've come close together. In fact, it's saying I've got more sludge going in than I can take out. I was at Redditch just yesterday actually, and they had exactly this problem. So they were struggling. They had quite a high sludge blanket in their tanks, and it was because they had some sort of blockage on their RAS line, and it was reducing that flow. In fairness, in Redditch it was completely blocked. So again, you can see that it's very sensitive to having anything go wrong with your RAS flow rate. So that's a really important parameter. And again, it's why it's a golden measure. Put it back to normal, and then lastly, if I was to take out a final settlement tank, clearly, if I take out a final settlement tank, I've got less capacity to deal with that sludge, and so that affects the area. In fairness, it affects the area for both. So what that does is, in my example, QT over Q is 2.8. For everything being equal, that puts that up to about there. It does also put that up. Right, I'm going to assume in my example you change the RAS rate accordingly. So again, it's fairly obvious to say, but if for any reason in my example of having 3 final tanks in operation, I have to take one of them out, I am really playing with fire in terms of blanket carryover. So I might want to mitigate the risk by trying to run with a lower. I might want to try and run with a lower mixed liquor suspended solids. Okay. Last example is, I'm not going to plot it on here, it's just one to be aware of. If you have to take your aeration lanes out for servicing, one of our aeration lanes, often to compensate for the lack of treatment, you'll raise the mixed liquor slightly. So even when you're doing stuff with your aeration lanes, don't underestimate the fact that if you have to raise mixed liquor, that straight away impacts this line here. Okay, so I think we've probably finished there, but just to suffice it to say that I don't expect people to go away and or do nomographs for their sites, but if you're worried about a sludge blanket, you might want to ask your process colleagues to help you do something like this to check the solids loading on your tank. Because there are a few urban myths out there. Some people say things like, well, I like to run with a bit of a sludge blanket. If you remember back to our what goes in must come out situation, if you've got a deepish sludge blanket in your tank, there's something not quite right, unless it's under massively storm conditions and it is very most stressed. If it's normal dry weather and you've got a sludge blanket in your tank, then something's wrong in your setup and you need to have a look at it. So I think that just pretty much ends where I'd like to get to this. So the point was some simple theory on why does sludge blanket come over and why is it important. We've introduced the nomograph here, which is a ready reckoner, and not to get the numbers off it, but just to show what's the relationship between these parameters. So if my sludge settlement goes wrong, that starts to mean I can't take as much sludge out. If my mixed liquors go up, that puts a real strain on how much load I'm trying to put on that tank. So hopefully from that you'll be able to see that there's a few key parameters, and in fairness they are these parameters: flow in, mixed liquor suspended solids, settlability of the sludge, underflow rate. They are the key things. So if you keep them right and keep golden measures right, you should be able to keep this middle bit in balance. And if you don't, they soon stack up to create a problem. Thanks very much.